Hello everyone, welcome back to video 5 in our video series on the introduction to web development in Spring. So today we're going to deploy our application online, and by the end of this video, we're going to be able to actually see our web application running on the internet, and we'll have a dedicated URL to be able to locate our app without just using localhost. So let's go. So at the end of the last video, we created a boots.html file and we added HTML, we added CSS, and we added JavaScript to it. So let's say we're very happy with our application right now and we want to put it online. So notice that our server is actually running, and we ran the server at the very beginning of these tutorial series, and we've been using localhost 8080 in order to locate these files. And basically what this localhost is a server that is running locally on my computer. So imagine that every time I send out a request, I'm actually sending a request to my local computer that's acting like a server. The problem with this is that if you type in localhost 8080/boots.html, you will not be able to see this version of my file. So what I want to do is be able to push it to a production host like render.com, which we're going to talk about in 1 second, so that anybody with a URL will be able to see the file that I've created. All right, so the first thing we need to do is go over to render.com, and if we go to dashboard.render.com, we're going to be able to sign in using one of these methods. So we can sign in using GitHub, GitLab, or Google. I'm going to sign in using Google, and I am going to pick this one, Bobby Chan SFU at google.com. And right now you can see that this is the dashboard. We can actually create a lot of different services, and I'll talk about some of these as we go along. But the first thing we should do is go into our account settings, and we should connect a GitHub account. Okay, so if we connect the GitHub account, this is going to make life a lot easier for us to deploy our application. So we'll connect, and it's going to ask us which GitHub account we have. I'm just going to sign in with my GitHub account, and we're going to be able to now connect to this service. So now that GitHub account is connected to Render, and this is very important, as you'll see later when we deploy our application. So the next thing I want to do is I want to get all of this code that I've written onto this service. And how we do that is through GitHub. So I'm going to go into GitHub, and I'm going to come in here, and I'm going to create a new repository. So right now I have a few repositories already set up. And right now let's set up a new repository. We're going to call this Springboot-render. Okay, so this is going to be the name that we create. We can provide a description as well, and I'm going to make this private. Now it's really up to you which one you want to have, but private will actually give us an extra layer of security in case we expose something we're not supposed to in our application. So I'm going to create this repository, and the next thing we should take note of is this URL that's given for our GitHub. So I'm just going to copy this over, and I'm going to jump back over to our application and stop this local server. So right now my local server is no longer running, and I'm going to put all of this code onto GitHub. So the first thing we're going to do is do a git init, which is going to initialize a Git repo for this project that I have. The next thing we'll do is we'll do a git remote add, and then I'm going to call it origin, and I'm going to give it that URL. So git remote add origin. Origin is just the name I'm going to call it. And right now, if we take a look at git remote, you'll see origin now exists. Okay, so what we can do is actually push all of our code to this repo, which I've called origin. All right, so how we get all this code on there is we can just do git add, which adds all of the code that we've written so far, all of the changes that we've made so far. We can now commit it, so git commit, and I'm going to give it a message, so I'm just going to call it init push. Okay, so this is my initialized push, and I'm going to commit that. So you'll notice that all of these files are now added. And finally, I'm going to do a git push origin main. All right, so this says I'm going to invoke the git push command and to origin. Now origin is referring to this URL right here, and this is the main branch that I want to connect to. So branching is something that's very important, especially if we're working in teams. I'm going to have a video about this a little bit later in the video series. So right now, if we do everything correctly, we'll find that main is pushed to main. So all of this should be pushed to this. So if we do a refresh, we'll actually see all of our code has now been pushed onto this repository. Now, if this is the first time you're using GitHub, you may have to add the SSH key. So I have a link down below in the description on how to do that. So if you're having trouble doing this last push, please take a look at that, add your SSH key, and everything should work out. All right, so the next thing we want to do is I want to add a Dockerfile to the root of our application. Now, it's not important that you know what Docker is, but this will help us to deploy the application on Render. So I'm going to start off by going into demo, and this is going to give me problems. So if I do new, and I'm going to create a file called Dockerfile. All All right, so Dockerfile needs to be in the root of the application. So I'm actually going to move it because I actually put it in the wrong folder. So right now, Dockerfile is in the root of the application called demo. So you'll notice that here we have, we're in the root of the application. And by the way, that is where I set my git init. So that's also very important. You have to make sure that your git init is actually in the root of your application. All right, so now in the Dockerfile, if we go in there, currently it's empty. So we need to do a couple of things. And how Docker works is that you're basically giving commands on how to install your application. So Docker is actually an engine that is run. And again, you do not have to install it locally on your computer. But once we get it onto render, render is going to have a Docker layer, and it's going to run all of these instructions associated with the Docker file or found in the Docker file. So the first thing we're going to do is jump over to Chrome, and I want to remind you of this Spring initializer. So a couple of things that we had to note from before, and just to remind you, we were using a Maven project and we called our name demo. Okay, those two things are important, as well as the fact that we're packaging in jar and we're running Java 17. So we have to note those three things. And if you don't remember, you can go back and you can take a look at which one of these options you set. So taking note of those things, I'm going to look up a few Docker images. So Docker is going to allow me to be able to run the associating project. So the first thing we need to find is the Maven associated with our Java version. So I'm running Java version 17. I'm going to do a quick search on Docker, Maven, OpenJDK 17. And one of these is going to give us the image, the current image. So right now I see that Maven 3.8.5, OpenJDK 17. Now the thing that we should do is take a note that this is a Docker official image, right? So those are usually the ones that are a little bit more secure. So I'm going to take note of that, and I'm going to go from, and then that image, and then I'm going to do as, and then I'm going to call it some variable name. So here we typically call it build. And basically what we're doing here is we're opening up a new image in Docker, and we're using this to basically run our Maven project. Okay, so we're using this image to run our Maven project. So we're not running it locally on my machine anymore. I'm actually running it in deployment. The next thing we're going to do is copy everything that we have. So copy ... means that I copy everything that I have in this project into that image. Okay, so I'm going to copy it into that image. So later on, when we get this onto our render project, so we're basically taking all of the code that's here and we're copying all of it into an image that's in Docker. All right, the third thing we're going to do is we're going to run a command that is going to install our application. So we're going to do Maven clean package, and then I'm going to do dskip tests. Okay, so Maven clean package dskip test. So we're going to skip the tests associated with this Maven project. And now what happens is that we're going to run we're going to use Maven 3.8.5, this OpenJDK, and we're going to run this Maven project. And the result is that in our target folder, there is going to be a .jar file. Remember earlier, I said that we are using a jar packaging, right? So we're going to package in jar, and now there's going to be a jar file that's inside of our Maven project. So the next thing we're going to do is, this is step 2, from, and then now we're going to look at OpenJDK. So I'm going to do another internet search. And this time I'm going to look for Docker OpenJDK 17 JDK. Now there's lots of versions of this, and probably the one that's going to work best is the JD-Slim. We're going to find that this is the Docker official image. So I'm going to take this as well. And now I'm going to say from this is the container that I'm going to use to run the application. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is copy from equals build. Now this build is talking about this project that we have up here. So this container that we're running, we're going to take whatever the outcome is, and from that image, we are going to copy over target/demo 0.1 -snapshot.jar into demo.jar. Okay, so basically what this is saying is I'm going to take from this image, I'm going to copy this, and by the way, this process would have created a file called demo-0.0.1-snapshot.jar. I'm going to copy that file into this new container called demo.jar. It's okay if you're not getting any of this. This is just the process that it's going to run. And by the way, if you named your project anything else, so back here, if you named your project anything else, you're going to replace that name with demo. Okay. Now, the next thing we're going to do is expose port 8080. Okay. So after all, that is the port that we're going to be running on. Okay. And then finally, we're going to do an entry point. An entry point means what command are we going to run on entry of this container. And the command that we're going to run is we're going to run Java. Java means that I'm going to execute the Java virtual machine. I'm going to execute a jar, and I'm going to execute the file demo.jar. So now if we did everything correctly, what this is going to do is this part right here is going to basically compile and package my application. This part down here is going to run my application. So that's what's in the Dockerfile, and that's what I'm going to give as an instruction to render when I actually start up this application. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to push that onto our repo. So we're going to come down here and we're going to do a git add again. So I'm going to add this file, the Docker file that I just created, and I'm going to do a git commit -m, and now we're just going to label it with something that makes sense. So I'm going to say added Docker file, and then we're going to do git push origin main. Okay, now once again, the origin refers to the URL that I'm pushing to, and main refers to the branch that I'm pushing to. All right, so now if everything goes well, this should push it to the main branch. And if we take a look at the main branch right now, and we do a refresh, this should now give me a Docker file. So now it's time to run it on render. So after we have our whole application there, after our Docker file has been set up, now it's time to go into render and start up a new service. So we're going to come over here. We're going to run a web service. Okay, so click on new, click on web service. And now notice that we've connected our repository. Automatically, it's going to ask us, which one do you want, right? So this is the one that we've just created. So I want to connect this resource. Okay, so I'm going to connect this repository. All right, so I'm going to connect, and right away, it's going to ask me for a name. So I'm just going to type in a name. This is my render project. So I'm going to do spring-render. This name may not be available, but if it's not available, it's going to give us something unique in our URL. And we're going to scroll down. We're going to make sure that this says Docker, and then we're going to make sure we're running on our free tier. Okay, so our free tier is going to give us this much RAM, this much CPU, which is enough for what we're doing. So then we're going to click on Create Web Service. So you'll notice that once we click on Create Web Service, it starts to create something, and you can see the progress here. I'm just going to maximize the progress, and you can see all the steps that it's taking. So again, the purpose of this is not to understand Docker, but really what it's doing here is it's running all of the Docker commands, and it's building all of the images out, and it's allowing us to be able to run this application. So if you remember what we wrote in the Docker file, it says compile it, package it, and then the second part of that Docker file says run it. Okay, so that is essentially what's happening here, and you can see that that is in fact what's happening. So if you scroll down, you see all of this is basically feedback from what is happening. All right, I'm going to minimize this back, and you can see that if we scroll on this, you can see kind of what's happening currently. All right, so this process is going to take a little bit of time. So what I'll do is fast forward the video until everything is done. So I'll talk to you in a little bit. All right, so we're back. So you'll notice that we started at around 3:54 p.m. and our process completed initialization at around 4:01 p.m. Now it says live here, but don't let this fool you, because usually once it says live, it still takes a few minutes for it to initialize. So there's still some background processes happening. So right now you can see that they give you actually a URL, and our URL is spring-render-6ALU. So if somebody has taken this name already, they will usually give you something unique in the URL. So if we click on this right now, this is a good sign. We're getting our white label error page just because in the root of our application, we actually don't have anything. So if we now type in boots.html, we should be able to see our boots file. Okay, so here's our boots file. If we go to our hello.html, it should give us our hello. Right, so instead of our localhost 8080, now we're given a URL, which everybody will be able to access the version of my file. All right, so the next thing is, let's pretend that I've uploaded something already and I'm going to make some changes. Okay, so maybe I have a next iteration of my web application and I want to change something about this application. So let's say I come back in here and I change boots somehow. So let's say instead of main content, I want it to say my main content. When I save this file, I won't see it reflected here just because it's not been pushed to development. So if you take a look over here under settings, we'll see that build and deploy is going to go from the main application. Okay. And if it says, and if we scroll down a little bit more, you'll see auto deploy says yes. And what that means is that whenever I push something to my repository, I want that automatically to be deployed. So you'll see right here, it says I deployed live, the tag that says added Dockerfile. Okay, so let's say I make a small change here, and right now I want to change my main content, right? So I want to add the word my here. And so the next thing we need to do is get that onto Git. So I'm going to do git add, and I'm going to do a git commit. Okay, and I'm going to label this the best I can. So I'm going to say changed header. Now, of course, in reality, just changing a header, I wouldn't recommend pushing it into the main again, but this is just an example. So I'm going to commit it. So notice that now everything is committed. The color actually has changed here on my IDE. And then we'll do a git push origin main. And once we push that, so once you see main has been pushed, you'll see automatically this triggers a new deployment. So right now it's running through all of that process again, right? So it's going through, running through the Dockerfile, making a new image, packaging it, and then running it again. So this is probably going to take us another 10 minutes or so. So right now I'm going to pause the video and I'm going to come back when the new deployment is live. All right, welcome back. The deployment has taken about 4 minutes. In general, I found that deploying usually takes between 5 to even 15 minutes. So anywhere in between there is standard. So we're going to go back and check out our application now. So this is our spring-render and the URL that we're given from render. And if we now do a refresh, you'll see my main content is installed. So the point I want to make here is whenever we do a deploy or whenever we do a push to our Git repo, the deployment is going to happen automatically. And you can see the logs running and stuff like that. So this is basically how we navigate through the UI for render. Now, if everything worked out for you, this is all I need to say in this video, so you can move on to the next video. However, in the rest of this video, what I want to do is talk about how to debug if things go wrong. So I just want to dig a little bit deeper as to what exactly is happening on the Dockerfile. So what we're actually doing here, if you want to follow along in this debugging part, you can go to docker.com and you can download the Docker desktop. Okay, so I've already downloaded this, and the Docker desktop allows us to be able to run a Docker image locally just to make sure it's working before we deploy it onto something like render. So here, I'm at the root of my demo, and if I want to run this image locally, I can do something like docker build -t, and then I'm going to call it some application. So I'm just going to call this my render app. Okay, so render app, and then the last parameter here that we have to give is where is the Docker file. So notice that I'm in my demo folder. I'm going to do dot to say that the Docker file is actually in the current folder. Okay, so this is actually just to locate where the Docker file is. So I'm just going to run this command, and you'll notice that this actually looks very similar to what we were seeing on render, right? So the output that was coming on render. And again, what this is doing is creating an image and allowing us to be able to run it, right? So right now, if you take a look at step 3, it's actually running Maven clean package. So it's creating the package currently, okay? And then of course, in our next step, we're going to be able to create something that we can run. Now, this is just to tell you what is actually happening on render. So on render, the first thing that it's doing is it's going to run the first image, or it's going to run the first part of the Dockerfile command. It's going to run this part. And then the second part is it's going to run this. Okay, so right now, if we take a look at our Docker images, so Docker images, you'll see that we have a render app that we've just created. Okay, so this is the application that we want to run if we want to actually run the application that we have. So we're going to do Docker run. And now what we need to do is assign the port. So we're going to do -port and then 8080:8080. So what this means is from the Docker that's running, so the Docker image that's running is going to be my Java application. When I type in 8080 in my local host, I want it to transfer to port 8080 within the container as well, within the Docker container as well. And I want to be able to run this render app. Okay, so I'm running this render app and I'm assigning the ports as follows. So when we run this, notice that it's running Spring, but it is running from the image that is called render app. So that is exactly what is happening when we push this onto render, right? When we push this onto render.com, it's actually running all of these commands. So now, just to test whether this thing is working out locally, I'm going to open up a new tab. If I go to localhost 8080 / and then we had our boots.html file, we should be able to see our boots.html file, but what is happening here is that we're actually going through Docker. We're going through the Docker image, accessing our application, and then this is the output that we see. So whether you see that this is, whether you can see the relationship between what's happening or not, that is really what's happening underneath the hood for render. Okay, so again, just walking through the whole process, if we go to if we push something onto render, right, we're running this Docker file, which packages it and runs it, and then it's going to basically deploy it to a URL so that we can go and take a look at it. Okay. So this last part, use it as kind of a debugging tool. So if you find that it wasn't deployed on render properly, you might want to come back and actually run it locally in terms of building the actual container for Docker and then running it locally and seeing if it works. Usually it doesn't work locally, and the reason is because we've got some of these versions wrong. So either the OpenJDK is wrong or the Maven version that we're running is wrong. So that's something that you have to play around with. Or another reason might be that the artifact or the name that you've called this project doesn't match up. Right, so you might want to make sure that the names match up. So hopefully this will help debug some of the issues that you might have. All right, so that's all I have for this video. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next video.